Welcome to another journey through the forgotten chapters of history. Tonight, we re-embarking on an epic voyage that spans over 11 centuries, from the gleaming domes of Constantinople to the final desperate siege that ended the last remnant of the Roman Empire. This is the story of the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire that refused to die. Picture this. It's May 11th, 330 CE, and you're standing on the 7 hills overlooking the Bosphorus Strait. Before you, a magnificent new city rises from the ancient foundations of Byzantium. Emperor Constantine the Great has just dedicated his new Rome, Constantinople, a city destined to become the longest surviving capital in human history. But how did this strategic Greek trading post become the heart of an empire that would endure for more than a millennium? How did the Byzantines preserve the treasures of classical antiquity through the Dark Ages, survive the rise of Islam, weather the Crusades, and maintain their identity as the last Romans until the very end? Tonight, we'll follow the complete saga of Byzantium, from Constantine's revolutionary founding through Justinian's golden age, from the iconoclastic controversies to the brilliant Macedonian Renaissance, from the catastrophic Fourth Crusade to the final heroic stand against Mehmed the Conqueror's cannons in 1453. This is a tale of emperors and empresses, of saints and scholars, of magnificent architecture and devastating plagues, of military genius and political intrigue. This is the story of how a civilization managed to be both Roman and Greek, both ancient and medieval, both earthly and divine. Let us begin this extraordinary journey through the rise and fall of the Byzantine Empire. Chapter 1. Constantine's Dream. The year is 324 CE, and the Roman Empire stands at a crossroads unlike any in its 1,000-year history. After decades of civil war, political chaos, and economic collapse, a single man has emerged victorious from the bloody struggle for supreme power. Constantine the Great, barely 50 years old, has just defeated his last rival, Licinius, at the Battle of Chrysopolis, making himself sole emperor of both East and West. You can imagine Constantine standing on the deck of his flagship as it sailed through the narrow strait of the Bosphorus, his experienced eyes taking in the remarkable geography spread before him. To his left lay Europe, to his right Asia, and ahead, perched on a triangular peninsula like a precious jewel set between 2 continents, stood the ancient Greek city of Byzantium. This was no chance visit. Constantine had been contemplating this moment for years, studying maps, consulting with advisors, and wrestling with one of the most momentous decisions in human history. The empire was simply too vast, too complex, and too threatened to be governed effectively from Rome. A new capital was needed, but where? The emperor's choice of Byzantium was nothing short of inspired. Founded by Greek colonists from Megara in 657 BCE, the city commanded one of the most strategic locations on Earth. The Bosphorus Strait was the only water passage between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, making it the natural crossroads for trade between Europe and Asia. The city sat on a defensible peninsula, protected by water on 3 sides and by steep hills that could be easily fortified. But Constantine saw more than just strategic advantages. He envisioned a city that would embody everything he wanted the Roman Empire to become: a Christian empire that combined the best of Roman administration with Greek culture and the new faith that was transforming the ancient world. The transformation began immediately. Constantine didn't simply rename Byzantium. He completely reimagined it. Drawing on the treasures of the entire empire, he began one of history's most ambitious construction projects. Columns, statues, and artistic masterpieces were transported from across the Mediterranean to adorn the new capital. The Serpent Column from Delphi, ancient Egyptian obelisks, and countless classical sculptures were installed in prominent locations throughout the city. The emperor personally planned the city's layout, expanding it to cover all 7 hills of the peninsula and dividing it into 14 districts, just like Rome. At the heart of the new city, he built the Great Palace, a sprawling complex of throne rooms, reception halls, and private apartments that would house emperors for the next 8 centuries. The hippodrome, originally built during the reign of Septimius Severus, was expanded and beautified to accommodate over 100,000 spectators for chariot races and imperial ceremonies. But perhaps most importantly, Constantine made Constantinople a Christian city from its very founding. Unlike Rome, with its pagan temples and centuries of traditional religious practices, the new capital would be consecrated to Christ. The emperor built magnificent churches throughout the city, including the Church of the Holy Apostles, where he planned to be buried alongside the tombs of the 12 apostles. The dedication ceremony on May 11, 330 CE, was unlike anything the ancient world had ever seen. Constantine himself led the procession through the city's main avenue, the Mazy, carrying what he claimed was a fragment of the true cross. 40 days of celebrations followed, with games in the hippodrome, distributions of food to the population, and elaborate religious ceremonies that blended Christian and imperial traditions. The emperor's vision extended far beyond mere architecture and ceremony. He understood that a successful capital needed more than impressive buildings. It required a thriving population of skilled administrators, craftsmen, merchants, and scholars. To attract settlers to his new city, Constantine offered extraordinary incentives. Senators who moved to Constantinople were granted free mansions and annual stipends of grain. Master craftsmen were given workshops and guaranteed commissions. Merchants were promised favorable trade terms and protection for their businesses. Perhaps most significantly, Constantine established a new form of government that would define Byzantine administration for centuries to come. He separated civilian and military authority, creating a complex bureaucracy of specialized departments that could efficiently manage an empire spanning 3 continents. The Praetorian Prefecture was divided into regional offices, while new court positions like the Grand Chamberlain and the Master of Offices centralized power around the emperor while ensuring that no single individual could challenge imperial authority. The economic foundation of the new capital was equally revolutionary. Constantine introduced a new gold coin, the solidus, which would become the standard currency for the entire Mediterranean world and remain stable for over 7 centuries. This economic innovation provided the financial stability necessary to fund the massive construction projects and maintain the complex administrative system that would keep the empire functioning through centuries of challenges. The religious implications of Constantine's choice were profound and far-reaching. By creating a Christian capital, he was making a statement about the future direction of the empire. While traditional Roman religion still had adherents throughout the empire, the new capital demonstrated that Christianity was not merely tolerated but actively promoted by imperial authority. The emperor's personal relationship with Christianity was complex and has been debated by historians for centuries. Whether his conversion was genuine religious conviction, political calculation, or a combination of both, Constantine's actions had enormous consequences. He convened the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE to address theological disputes within the Church, established Christianity as the preferred religion of the imperial court, and began the process that would eventually transform the Roman Empire into a Christian state. The choice of location also had profound cultural implications. While Rome remained the symbolic heart of the empire's Latin traditions, Constantinople became the center of its Greek heritage. Constantine deliberately chose to emphasize the city's Greek character, even as he maintained Roman administrative and legal traditions. This cultural synthesis would become one of Byzantium's defining characteristics, the preservation of Roman political structures within a fundamentally Greek cultural context. The reaction to Constantine's new capital was mixed. Many traditional Romans viewed the project with suspicion or outright hostility, seeing it as an abandonment of the city that had ruled the world for centuries. Some senators refused to relocate, preferring to maintain their ancestral homes and traditional privileges in Rome. Others worried that dividing imperial attention between two capitals would weaken rather than strengthen the empire. But Constantine's vision proved remarkably prescient. Within a generation, Constantinople had become one of the largest and most prosperous cities in the world. Its population swelled to over 500,000 inhabitants by the end of the 4th century, making it a true rival to Rome in size and importance. More importantly, the new capital provided the administrative and military base that would allow the Eastern Roman Empire to survive and flourish even as the Western Empire crumbled under barbarian invasions. The emperor's death in 337 CE marked the end of an era, but his legacy was secure. Constantinople was not merely another Roman city, but the foundation of what would become a new form of empire, one that would preserve Roman law and administration, Greek learning and culture, and Christian faith through the turbulent centuries ahead. When Constantine was buried in the Church of the Holy Apostles, he was interred not just as a Roman emperor, but as the founder of a new Christian empire that would endure for over 1,000 years. His dream of a new Rome had become reality, and that reality would shape the course of world history for centuries to come. The stage was now set for the emergence of what later historians would call the Byzantine Empire, an empire that would consider itself Roma until its very last day, yet develop its own unique character that blended the best of East and West ancient and medieval pagan and Christian traditions into something entirely new in human history. Chapter 2. The empire takes shape. Following Constantine's death in 337 CE, the empire he had reunited once again faced the familiar specter of civil war and division. The great emperor left behind 3 sons, Constantine II, Constans, and Constantinius II, who immediately began competing for control of their father's legacy. What followed was a bloody decade of fraternal conflict that would establish a pattern of succession crises that would plague the empire for centuries. You can imagine the confusion and anxiety that gripped Constantinople during these uncertain years. The magnificent new capital, barely 7 years old, suddenly found itself at the center of a power struggle that threatened to tear apart everything Constantine had built. Palace intrigues multiplied as courtiers attempted to position themselves with whichever brother seemed most likely to emerge victorious. Constantine II, who controlled Gaul, Spain, and Britain, was the first to fall. In 340 CE, he invaded Italy in an attempt to seize territory from his younger brother Constans, only to be killed in an ambush near Aquileia. Constans, now master of the entire Western Empire, seemed poised to challenge Constantinius II for supremacy, but his increasingly erratic behavior and heavy taxation policies provoked widespread resentment. In 350 CE, a military revolt led by Maxentius overthrew and killed Constans, leaving Constantinius II as the sole surviving son of Constantine. But rather than bringing stability, this left the empire divided between a legitimate emperor in the east and a usurper in the west. The resulting civil war lasted 3 years and devastated both halves of the empire before Constantinius finally defeated Maxentius at the Battle of Mons Seleucus in 353 CE. Constantinius II's victory made him the sole ruler of the entire Roman Empire for the first time since his father's death. But the empire he inherited was vastly different from the one Constantine had left. The constant warfare had drained the treasury, disrupted trade networks, and weakened the military. More ominously, barbarian tribes along the frontiers had taken advantage of Roman distraction to launch increasingly bold raids into imperial territory. The new emperor faced these challenges with a combination of administrative reform and military reorganization that would set important precedents for future Byzantine governance. Constantius expanded the bureaucratic system his father had begun, creating specialized departments for different aspects of imperial administration. The Sacred Consistory became the emperor's primary advisory council, while the Master of Offices supervised the complex web of palace officials who managed day-to-day governance. Perhaps most significantly, Constantine II established the principle that would become central to Byzantine political theory: the emperor as God's representative on earth. This concept, which blended Roman imperial traditions with Christian theology, provided a new form of legitimacy that didn't depend solely on military success or senatorial approval. The emperor was accountable to God alone, ruling by divine right and responsible for maintaining both earthly order and spiritual purity within his realm. This theological innovation had profound practical consequences. It meant that challenges to imperial authority weren't merely political disagreements, but acts of rebellion against God's chosen representative. It also gave emperors unprecedented authority over religious matters, establishing the pattern of Caesaropapism imperial control over church affairs that would characterize Byzantine governance for centuries. Constantine II's religious policies demonstrated both the power and the dangers of this new imperial role. Unlike his father, who had maintained a relatively tolerant approach to religious diversity, Constantius was a fervent Arian Christian who used imperial power to promote his theological views. He exiled Orthodox bishops, closed pagan temples, and attempted to impose Arian Christianity throughout the empire. These policies provoked widespread resistance and contributed to the religious and cultural tensions that would plague the empire for generations. Traditional Romans resented the attack on their ancestral customs, while Orthodox Christians viewed the emperor as a heretic who was perverting the faith Constantine had legalized. The emperor's cousin Julian, whom Constantius had appointed as Caesar to help manage the empire's vast territories, was among those who began to question whether the Christian transformation of the empire had gone too far. Julian's appointment as Caesar in 355 CE marked the beginning of one of the most extraordinary episodes in Roman history. Educated in philosophy and rhetoric rather than military science, the young prince seemed an unlikely candidate for imperial power. But when he was sent to Gaul to restore order on the troubled Rhine frontier, Julian proved to be a military genius whose victories against the Alemanni and Franks restored Roman prestige and secured the empire's northern borders. More importantly, Julian's time in Gaul allowed him to develop his own vision of what the empire should become. Influenced by Neoplatonic philosophy and traditional Roman values, he began to believe that the empire's problems stemmed from its abandonment of the gods who had made Rome great. When Constantius II died suddenly in 361 CE, Julian found himself sole emperor of the Roman world and immediately began implementing the most dramatic religious counter-revolution in the empire's history. Julian the Apostate, as he would be known to Christian historians, attempted nothing less than the complete restoration of traditional Roman religion. He reopened pagan temples, restored the old priesthoods, and began an intellectual campaign designed to undermine Christian influence throughout the empire. At the same time, he maintained the administrative and military reforms of his predecessors, while adding his own innovations in law and government. The emperor's religious revolution extended to Constantinople itself, where he attempted to diminish the Christian character that Constantine had given the city. While he didn't destroy Christian churches, he restored pagan temples and reintroduced traditional Roman ceremonies. The hippodrome once again hosted gladiatorial games alongside chariot races, and the emperor himself participated in pagan sacrificial rites within sight of the city's Christian population. But Julian's reign lasted only 2 years. In 363 CE, while campaigning against the Sasanian Empire in Mesopotamia, the emperor was killed in battle, possibly by a Christian soldier in his own army. His death marked the end of the last serious attempt to reverse the Christianization of the Roman Empire, and cleared the way for Christianity to become not just the preferred religion of the imperial court, but the official faith of the entire empire. Julian's successor, Jovian, immediately restored Christianity to its favored position, but his reign lasted less than a year. The accession of Valentinian I in 364 CE brought a new approach to imperial governance that would have lasting consequences for both East and West. Recognizing that the empire was simply too large and complex for one man to govern effectively, Valentinian appointed his brother Valens as emperor in the East, while he retained control of the western provinces. This division, which was intended to be temporary and administrative rather than permanent and political, gradually hardened into a genuine partition of the empire. While both emperors maintained the fiction that they ruled a single state, in practice the Eastern and Western empires increasingly developed separate identities, administrative systems, and strategic priorities. The reign of Valens in the East, 364 to 378 CE, demonstrated both the challenges and opportunities facing the nascent Byzantine Empire. On the positive side, the eastern provinces were generally more prosperous and politically stable than their western counterparts. Cities like Constantinople, Antioch, and Alexandria continued to flourish as centers of trade and learning. The eastern armies, though smaller than the western legions, were generally better trained and equipped. However, Valens also faced unprecedented challenges. The Hunnic migrations were pushing Germanic tribes westward, creating pressure all along the Danube frontier. In 376 CE, the Visigoths requested permission to cross the Danube and settle within the empire as foederati allied, tribes who would provide military service in exchange for land and subsidies. Valens agreed, but corruption among Roman officials and mistreatment of the Gothic refugees led to rebellion. The Gothic War that followed revealed serious weaknesses in the Eastern Empire's military and administrative systems. Despite their numerical superiority, Roman forces struggled to contain the Gothic uprising. The crisis reached its climax at the Battle of Adrianople in 378 CE, where Valens was killed and the Eastern army suffered one of the worst defeats in Roman military history. The disaster at Adrianople marked a turning point in the empire's relationship with the barbarian tribes beyond its borders. Previous emperors had generally been able to maintain Roman military superiority through superior organization, equipment, and tactics. But the Gothic victory demonstrated that this advantage was no longer decisive and that new approaches to frontier defense would be necessary. The crisis that followed Valens' death brought to power one of the most significant emperors in the history of the Eastern Empire, Theodosius the Great. His reign, 379 to 395 CE, would complete the Christian transformation of the empire and establish many of the political and religious patterns that would define Byzantine civilization for centuries to come. Chapter 3. Theodosius the Great. In the aftermath of the catastrophic defeat at Adrianople, the Roman Empire faced perhaps the gravest crisis in its thousand-year history. The Eastern army was shattered, the emperor was dead, and Gothic tribes roamed freely through the Balkans, threatening Constantinople itself. Into this chaos stepped a Spanish general named Theodosius, whose reign from 379 to 395 CE would transform not just the immediate crisis, but the fundamental character of the empire for all time. Picture the scene as Theodosius entered Constantinople for the first time as emperor in November 380 CE, the great city that Constantine had envisioned, as a Christian Rome was in panic. Refugees from the Gothic raids crowded the streets, while rumors spread that the barbarians were preparing to besiege the capital itself. The new emperor faced a choice that would define his legacy. Would he attempt to restore the old Roman military supremacy through conquest, or would he seek new solutions to the empire's unprecedented challenges? Theodosius chose transformation over tradition, negotiating a settlement with the Goths that fundamentally changed the nature of the Roman Empire. Rather than attempting to expel or destroy the Gothic tribes, he invited them to settle permanently within the empire as foederati federated allies who would maintain their own leaders and, customs while providing military service to Rome. This policy, known as the Gothic settlement of 382 CE, marked the beginning of the empire's evolution from a classical Roman state to the medieval Byzantine Empire. The Gothic settlement was controversial from the beginning and would remain so throughout Theodosius's reign. Traditional Romans viewed it as a betrayal of imperial dignity and a dangerous precedent that would encourage further barbarian demands. Military commanders worried that relying on barbarian allies would weaken Roman military effectiveness and create potential rivals within the empire itself. Religious leaders debated whether Arian Gothic Christians could be trusted to serve a newly Orthodox emperor. But Theodosius understood that the old Roman solution of endless warfare against barbarian tribes was no longer sustainable. The empire's resources were stretched thin, its population was declining in many regions, and new threats were emerging faster than they could be contained through military force alone. The Gothic settlement represented a new approach that sought to turn potential enemies into allies while maintaining imperial authority through negotiation rather than conquest. The emperor's religious policies were equally revolutionary and far more lasting in their consequences. In 380 CE, Theodosius issued the Edict of Thessalonica, which declared Nicene Christianity to be the official religion of the Roman Empire. This wasn't merely a statement of imperial preference, but a fundamental redefinition of what it meant to be Roman. For the first time in the empire's history, religious orthodoxy became a requirement of citizenship. You can imagine the impact of this decree as it was read in the forums and marketplaces of cities throughout the empire. Suddenly, the religious diversity that had characterized Roman civilization for centuries was no longer tolerated. Pagan temples were ordered closed, traditional sacrifices were banned, and those who persisted in non-Christian religious practices faced legal penalties and social ostracism. The enforcement of Christian orthodoxy extended beyond mere religious observance to encompass moral and social behavior. Theodosius banned gladiatorial games, restricted divorce, and introduced new laws governing family relationships that reflected Christian rather than traditional Roman values. The transformation was so complete that by the end of his reign, the empire had become recognizably Christian in ways that would have been unimaginable just a generation earlier. The First Council of Constantinople, convened by Theodosius in 381 CE, completed the theological foundation of the Christian empire. This council, attended by 150 Eastern bishops, confirmed the Nicene Creed and established the doctrinal framework that would define Orthodox Christianity for centuries. More importantly for imperial politics, it elevated the Bishop of Constantinople to a position second only to the Pope in Rome, creating a powerful religious authority that was closely aligned with imperial interests. This elevation of Constantinople's ecclesiastical status had profound political implications. It meant that the Eastern Empire now possessed its own independent religious authority that could rival Rome's claims to universal Christian leadership. While the council has decreed that the Bishop of Constantinople shall have the primacy of honor after the Bishop of Rome, because Constantinople is New Rome, seemed to acknowledge papal supremacy, it also established the foundation for the eventual split between Eastern and Western Christianity. Theodosius's administrative reforms were as significant as his religious policies. He completed the separation of civilian and military authority that Constantine had begun, creating a complex bureaucracy that could manage the empire's affairs even when the emperor was absent on military campaigns. The Praetorian prefects became the senior civilian officials, responsible for taxation, justice, and administration throughout their respective territories. The master of soldiers commanded the army, while a host of specialized officials managed everything from palace ceremonies to foreign diplomacy. This bureaucratic system was designed to prevent any single individual from accumulating enough power to challenge the emperor, but it also created new forms of corruption and inefficiency. The multiplication of offices meant that simple decisions often required approval from multiple departments, while the separation of authority frequently led to conflicts between civilian and military officials. However, the system's advantages outweighed its disadvantages, providing the administrative stability that would allow the Byzantine Empire to survive and flourish for another 1,000 years. The emperor's military reforms were equally innovative and necessary. The traditional Roman legions were gradually replaced by smaller, more flexible units that could respond quickly to threats along the empire's vast frontiers. Barbarian troops, serving under their own officers but equipped and trained according to Roman standards, became an increasingly important component of the imperial army. This transformation reflected the empire's evolution from a conquering state to a defensive one, focused on maintaining existing territories rather than acquiring new ones. Perhaps most significantly, Theodosius established the principle of dynastic succession that would become central to Byzantine political theory. Unlike earlier emperors who had often emerged from military or senatorial backgrounds, Theodosius made it clear that imperial authority would pass to his sons regardless of their military or administrative qualifications. This represented a fundamental shift from the Roman Republican tradition of merit-based leadership to a medieval concept of hereditary monarchy blessed by divine authority. The emperor, as handling of internal crises, demonstrated both the power and the limitations of this new form of imperial authority. When the citizens of Thessalonica rioted in 390 CE and killed a Gothic military commander, Theodosius ordered a massacre that killed thousands of innocent civilians. The emperor's initial refusal to acknowledge wrongdoing led to a dramatic confrontation with Ambrose, the powerful bishop of Milan, who excommunicated the emperor and forced him to perform public penance for his actions. This episode illustrated the complex relationship between imperial and ecclesiastical authority that would characterize Byzantine politics for centuries. While the emperor was supreme in temporal matters, religious leaders could challenge imperial decisions on moral and theological grounds. The successful assertion of episcopal authority over imperial power in this instance established important precedents for church-state relations throughout the Christian world. Theodosius' death in 395 CE marked the end of an era and the beginning of permanent division between East and West. The emperor's decision to divide the empire between his two young sons, Arcadius in the east and Honorius in the west, was intended to be temporary, but it became permanent when the two courts developed separate interests and competing priorities. Never again would a single emperor rule the entire Roman Empire. The legacy of Theodosius the Great extended far beyond his immediate political and military achievements. He had transformed the Roman Empire into a Christian state, established administrative and military systems that would endure for centuries, and created the foundation for what would become the Byzantine Empire. His reign marked the point at which the Eastern Empire ceased to be simply the eastern half of Rome and began to develop its own distinct identity. When Theodosius was buried in Constantinople, he was mourned not just as a Roman emperor, but as the founder of Christian imperial civilization. His tomb in the Church of the Holy Apostles, near that of Constantine, symbolized the continuity between the empire's founder and its transformer. The Christian empire they had created would face many challenges in the centuries ahead, but the foundation they had laid would prove strong enough to support one of history's most enduring civilizations. The stage was now set for the emergence of a truly Byzantine identity, one that would blend Roman political traditions with Greek culture and Christian faith into something entirely new in human experience. Chapter 4. The Age of Justinian. The year is 527 CE, and Constantinople awakens to a new dawn under Emperor Justinian I, a man whose ambitions would reshape the known world and create monuments that endure to this day. Standing barely 5 feet tall but possessing an intellect and drive that towered over his contemporaries, Justinian ascended the throne with a vision that seemed impossible. to restore the Roman Empire to its ancient glory and unite the civilized world under Christian rule. You can imagine the excitement that gripped the imperial court as the new emperor outlined his plans to his closest advisors. For nearly a century and a half, the Western Roman Empire had been lost to barbarian kingdoms, Vandals in North Africa, Ostrogoths in Italy, and Visigoths in Spain. But Justinian refused to accept these losses as permanent. He believed that divine providence had chosen him to reunite East and West under the purple banner of Rome, and he was prepared to stake everything on this momentous gamble. The emperor's confidence wasn't misplaced. He inherited an empire that had been carefully rebuilt and strengthened by his predecessors. The treasury was full, the army was professional and well-trained, and Constantinople had grown into one of the world's largest and most prosperous cities. More importantly, Justinian possessed two crucial assets that would enable his ambitious plans: extraordinary administrative abilities and a partnership with one of history's most remarkable women, his wife, Empress Theodora. Theodora has risen from humble origins, possibly as an actress and dancer, to become co-ruler of the empire was unprecedented in Roman history. Her influence over Justinian was complete, and her political judgment was often superior to his own. During the devastating Nika riots of 532 CE, when angry crowds nearly drove Justinian from his throne, it was Theodora who stiffened the emperor's resolve with her famous declaration, "Purple makes a fine shroud." Her courage and determination saved the dynasty and allowed Justinian's dreams of restoration to proceed. The riots themselves revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of Justinian's empire. The immediate cause was a dispute over chariot racing in the hippodrome, but the underlying tensions went much deeper. High taxes, religious controversies, and social inequalities had created widespread resentment among Constantinople's population. When the Blues and Greens, the city's rival factions that organized around chariot racing teams, temporarily united against the government, the resulting violence nearly destroyed the capital. For 5 days, Constantinople burned as rioters controlled the streets and acclaimed a rival emperor. The palace was besieged, churches were looted, and it seemed that Justinian's reign might end before his great plans could be attempted. But the emperor's response demonstrated the ruthless efficiency that would characterize his entire reign. General Belisarius and Mundus were ordered to restore order by any means necessary, and their troops slaughtered over 30,000 rioters in the hippodrome itself. The brutal suppression of the Nika riots eliminated Justinian's domestic opposition and provided an opportunity for the massive rebuilding program that would transform Constantinople into the wonder of the medieval world. The emperor immediately began reconstruction of the burned areas, but his most ambitious project was the complete rebuilding of the great church of Hagia Sophia, which had been destroyed in the rioting. Picture the scene as Justinian surveyed the ruins of the old church and explained his vision to the architects Anthemius of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus. The new Hagia Sophia would not merely replace the destroyed building, it would surpass every structure ever built, combining Roman engineering with Greek mathematics and Christian symbolism to create an architectural miracle that would proclaim the empire's past power and piety to the world. The construction of Hagia Sophia became the most ambitious building project since the pyramids. Over 10,000 workers labored for 5 years, using materials brought from across the known world. Marble came from quarries throughout the empire, porphyry from Egypt, and precious metals from the treasury's reserves. The revolutionary engineering techniques required to support the massive dome stretched the limits of contemporary knowledge and created a space that seemed to defy the laws of physics. When Justinian entered the completed Hagia Sophia for the first time in 537 CE, he reportedly exclaimed, "Solomon, I have surpassed you." The emperor's boast was not empty. His great church was indeed larger and more magnificent than Solomon's temple. and its soaring dome created an interior space unlike anything that had ever been built. The church became not just a place of worship, but a symbol of imperial power and divine favor that inspired awe in visitors for centuries. But architecture was only one aspect of Justinian's comprehensive program of imperial restoration. His legal reforms, compiled in the Corpus Juris Civilis, or Code of Justinian, provided a systematic organization of Roman law that would influence legal systems throughout the world for over a millennium. The code preserved the accumulated legal wisdom of centuries while adapting it to Christian principles and contemporary needs. The legal reforms reflected Justinian's vision of himself as God's vicegerent on earth, responsible for creating a perfect Christian state that reflected divine justice. The emperor's authority was absolute, but it was also bound by law and Christian morality. This balance between imperial power and legal restraint created a form of government that was both effective and legitimate, providing the foundation for Byzantine political theory throughout the empire's remaining history. However, Justinian's greatest ambitions lay in military conquest and the restoration of the empire's ancient boundaries. The emperor's campaigns began in 533 CE with the invasion of Vandal North Africa, led by his brilliant general Belisarius. The speed and completeness of this victory surprised everyone, including Justinian himself. Within a year, the Vandal kingdom was destroyed. Its treasures were carried off to Constantinople, and North Africa was restored to imperial rule. The success in Africa encouraged Justinian to attempt a far more difficult conquest of Italy, where the Ostrogothic kingdom had ruled for over 50 years. The Gothic War that began in 535 CE would last nearly 20 years and exhaust both the empire's resources and the peninsula's population. But ultimately, Belisarius and his successor, Narses, succeeded in destroying Ostrogothic power and restoring imperial control over the Italian peninsula, including the city of Rome itself. You can imagine the celebrations in Constantinople when news arrived that imperial troops had once again entered the Eternal City. For the first time in over half a century, Roman emperors ruled Rome itself, and Justinian's dream of restoration seemed within reach. The emperor's forces also achieved significant victories in Spain, recovering southeastern territories from the Visigoths and establishing imperial control over much of the western Mediterranean. At its height around 550 CE, Justinian's empire stretched from the Euphrates to Gibraltar, encompassing most of the territories that had belonged to the classical Roman Empire. Constantinople had become the capital of a state that included Italy, North Africa, the Balkans, Asia Minor, Syria, and much of Spain. The emperor's coins proclaimed him ever victorious Augustus and depicted him wearing the regalia of ancient Roman triumph. But this vast territorial expansion came at an enormous cost. The constant warfare had drained the imperial treasury, devastated entire regions, and stretched the army's resources to the breaking point. The empire's eastern frontier was constantly threatened by the Sasanian Empire, requiring expensive defensive measures and periodic military campaigns. Worse still, a devastating plague struck the empire in 541 CE, killing perhaps one-third of the population and undermining the economic foundation of Justinian's achievements. The plague of Justinian was unlike any disaster the empire had previously experienced. Starting in Egypt and spreading along trade routes throughout the Mediterranean, the disease reached Constantinople in 542 CE and infected the emperor himself, though he survived. The demographic catastrophe that followed undermined every aspect of imperial policy. Tax revenues collapsed. Military recruitment became difficult, and entire cities were depopulated. Despite these challenges, Justinian refused to abandon his vision of restoration. He continued to commission great building projects throughout the empire, established new cities and fortifications, and patronized scholars who preserved and transmitted classical learning to future generations. The emperor's court became a center of intellectual activity that attracted the best minds of the age, including the historian Procopius and the poet Paul the Silentiary. When Justinian died in 565 CE, after a reign of 38 years, he left behind an empire that was both greater and more fragile than the one he had inherited. His territorial conquests had restored much of the ancient Roman Empire. His legal code had created a lasting foundation for imperial administration, and his architectural monuments had demonstrated the empire's continued power and piety. But the costs of these achievements had been enormous, and his successors would struggle to maintain what he had accomplished. The age of Justinian represented both the high point of Byzantine ambition and the beginning of its transformation from a Mediterranean empire to a more modest but ultimately more durable medieval state. The emperor's dream of restoration had been partially realized, but the challenges of maintaining his conquests would ultimately prove beyond the resources of even the mighty Byzantine Empire. Chapter 5. The Crucible of Survival. As the 6th century drew to a close, the magnificent empire that Justinian had restored faced threats that would have destroyed any lesser civilization. Within decades of the great emperor's death, the carefully reconstructed Mediterranean world began to crumble under pressures that seemed to come from every direction at once. The Lombards invaded Italy, Slavs and Avars poured into the Balkans, and most devastating of all, a new religion emerged from the Arabian Peninsula that would forever change the ancient world. Picture Constantinople in the year 610 CE as the young Heraclius arrived from Africa to overthrow the usurper Phocas and claim the imperial throne. The city that had been the wonder of the world under Justinian was now a shadow of its former self. The great aqueducts had fallen into disrepair, the population had declined dramatically due to plague and warfare, and the treasury was virtually empty. Entire quarters of the city lay abandoned, while those still inhabited were crowded with refugees from the empire's lost territories. The new emperor inherited a catastrophe that would have overwhelmed any ordinary ruler. In the east, the Sasanian Empire under Khosrow II had launched the most successful invasion of Roman territory in centuries. Persian armies had conquered Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, capturing Jerusalem in 614 CE and carrying off the true cross to Ctesiphon. In the west, the Lombards controlled most of Italy except for a few coastal cities and the immediate vicinity of Rome. The Balkans were virtually lost to Slavic tribes and Avar raiders who threatened Constantinople itself. Heraclius faced a choice that would define not just his reign but the future character of the empire. Should he attempt to preserve the vast territories Justinian had conquered, or should he concentrate on defending a smaller but more defensible core? His decision to abandon the dream of Mediterranean restoration and focus on creating a more compact, militarily efficient state marked the true beginning of the Byzantine Empire as distinct from its Roman predecessor. The emperor's first priority was the eastern frontier, where Persian success threatened the empire's most valuable provinces. But Heraclius understood that traditional Roman military tactics would not suffice against enemies who had learned to counter imperial advantages in organization and equipment. Instead, he initiated a series of reforms that would transform the Byzantine military system and create the foundation for the empire's survival through centuries of warfare. The theme system that emerged during Heraclius's reign represented a revolutionary approach to imperial defense. Instead of maintaining expensive professional armies in distant territories, the emperor established military districts called themes, where soldier farmers received land grants in exchange for military service. This system created a motivated, locally based military force that could respond quickly to threats while supporting itself economically through agricultural production. You can imagine the transformation as former mercenaries and barbarian foederati were settled on abandoned lands throughout Asia Minor, receiving both military equipment and farming tools from the imperial government. These soldier farmers had a direct stake in defending their territories, since invasion would mean the loss of their homes and livelihoods. The system also reduced the empire's military expenses while creating a loyal population that identified closely with imperial interests. The cultural and religious transformation of the empire during this period was equally significant. As Latin-speaking territories in the West were lost to barbarian kingdoms, Greek increasingly became the dominant language of administration and culture. Heraclius himself was the first emperor to adopt the Greek title Basileus instead of the Latin Augustus, symbolically acknowledging the empire's evolution from Roman to Byzantine identity. The emperor's religious policies reflected both desperate necessity and genuine conviction. Faced with the loss of Jerusalem and the apparent triumph of Persia, Heraclius presented his eastern campaigns as a holy war to recover Christian territories from Zoroastrian rulers. When he finally defeated the Persians and recovered the True Cross in 628 CE, the emperor personally carried the sacred relic back to Jerusalem in a triumph that seemed to vindicate divine support for the empire. But Heraclius' greatest victory over Persia proved to be a Pyrrhic triumph that left both empires exhausted and vulnerable to a new threat that no one had anticipated. While Byzantines and Persians fought their final war, the Prophet Muhammad was uniting the Arabian Peninsula under the banner of Islam. When Muslim armies burst out of the desert in the 630s, they encountered two ancient empires that had virtually destroyed each other in their struggle for supremacy. The speed and scope of Muslim conquests stunned the civilized world. Within a decade, the Arabs had conquered Syria and Palestine, including the cities of Damascus and Jerusalem that Heraclius had fought so hard to recover from Persia. Egypt fell to Muslim armies in 641 CE, depriving the empire of its richest province and most reliable source of grain. By 650 CE, the Byzantine Empire had lost two-thirds of its territory and most of its wealthiest provinces to the new Islamic State. The loss of Syria, Palestine, and Egypt was traumatic not just economically, but psychologically and theologically. These were the Holy Land where Christ had lived and died, the centers of early Christianity, and the source of much of the empire's wealth and population. The speed with which they fell to Muslim armies seemed to call into question divine support for the Christian empire and raise troubling questions about God's plan for his chosen people. The empire's response to these catastrophic losses revealed both remarkable resilience and dangerous internal divisions. Monophysite Christians in Syria and Egypt, who had been persecuted by Constantinople for their theological views, often welcomed Muslim rule as preferable to Byzantine orthodoxy. This religious fragmentation weakened imperial resistance and highlighted the extent to which theological controversies had undermined political unity. The iconoclastic controversy that erupted in the 8th century reflected the empire's ongoing struggle to understand why God had permitted such devastating defeats. Emperor Leo III, who successfully defended Constantinople against Muslim siege in 717 to 718 CE, became convinced that the empire's military failures were divine punishment for the sin of icon worship. His iconoclastic edict of 726 CE banned religious images and launched a theological and political crisis that would convulse the empire for over a century. Picture the chaos that erupted throughout the empire as imperial officials attempted to implement the iconoclastic decrees. In Constantinople, mobs rioted when soldiers tried to remove the famous icon of Christ from the chalk gate. Monks fled to southern Italy and Sicily, carrying with them precious manuscripts and artistic treasures. Entire themes revolted against iconoclastic policies, while the papacy in Rome condemned the emperor as a heretic and severed diplomatic relations with Constantinople. The iconoclastic period revealed fundamental tensions within Byzantine society about the role of religion in imperial policy and the limits of imperial authority over spiritual matters. While some supported the emperor's efforts to purify Christianity and restore divine favor, others viewed iconoclasm as an attack on traditional orthodoxy that undermined the empire's Christian identity. The controversy also reflected deeper anxieties about cultural and political survival in the face of overwhelming external pressures. Despite these internal divisions, the empire demonstrated remarkable staying power during the dark centuries following Justinian's death. The theme system proved its effectiveness by enabling successful defense of the empire's core territories in Asia Minor and the Balkans. Constantinople's massive land and sea walls, strengthened and expanded by successive emperors, proved impregnable to repeated Muslim sieges. Most importantly, the empire retained control of the sea, allowing it to maintain communications between its scattered territories and preserve trade networks that sustained its economy. The empire's intellectual and cultural achievements during this period belied the military and political struggles that dominated contemporary chronicles. Byzantine scholars preserved and copied classical texts that would otherwise have been lost, while theologians developed sophisticated philosophical systems that influenced religious thought throughout the medieval world. The empire's schools and libraries continued to function even during the worst crises, ensuring that learning and literacy survived the collapse of urban life in much of Europe. The gradual stabilization of the empire during the later 8th century set the stage for one of history's most remarkable recoveries. The resolution of the iconoclastic controversy under Empress Irene and her successors removed a major source of internal division, while the development of more effective military and administrative systems provided the foundation for renewed expansion. The empire that emerged from this crucible of survival was smaller and more Greek than its Roman predecessor, but it was also more cohesive and ultimately more durable. When the Macedonian dynasty ascended the throne in 867 CE, they inherited an empire that had been tested by every possible catastrophe and had survived them all. The Dark Ages were ending, and a new golden age was about to begin, one that would see Byzantine power reach heights that even Justinian might have envied. Chapter 6. The Macedonian Renaissance. The year is 867 CE, and Constantinople stands on the threshold of its greatest age. From the ashes of the iconoclastic controversies and the devastating Arab conquests, a new dynasty has emerged that will transform the truncated Byzantine Empire into the most powerful and prosperous state in the medieval world. The Macedonian dynasty, founded by the peasant-turned-emperor Basil I, would rule for nearly 2 centuries and preside over what historians now call the Macedonian Renaissance, an era of military triumph, territorial expansion, artistic achievement, and intellectual flowering that rivals any golden age in human history. You can imagine the optimism that filled the corridors of the Great Palace as the new dynasty established itself. After generations of defensive warfare and internal strife, the empire was finally stable enough to think beyond mere survival. The treasury was rebuilding, the theme system had created a loyal and effective military force, and the resolution of the iconoclastic controversy had restored religious unity. Most importantly, the caliphate that had seemed so invincible in the 7th and 8th centuries was now fracturing into competing dynasties that could be played against each other or defeated in detail. Basil I's reign, 867 to 886 CE, marked the beginning of this remarkable transformation. Despite his humble origins and brutal rise to power, he had assassinated his predecessor. Michael III Basil proved to be an exceptional ruler who combined military skill with administrative genius and cultural patronage. His legal reforms, compiled in the Basilica, updated Justinian's legal code for contemporary needs while maintaining its fundamental principles. His building programs restored much of Constantinople's former magnificence while adding new architectural marvels that proclaimed the empire's renewed confidence. But it was under Basil's successors, particularly Basil II Bulgaroctonos, the Bulgar slayer, that the Macedonian Renaissance reached its zenith. The empire that Basil II inherited in 976 CE was already formidable, but the empire he left at his death in 1025 CE was the dominant power from the Danube to the Euphrates, from the Caucasus to Sicily. His reign represented the high water mark of medieval Byzantine power and the fulfillment of dreams that had seemed impossible just 2 centuries earlier. The military achievements of the Macedonian period were extraordinary by any standard. In the east, a series of brilliant campaigns pushed the frontier deep into Muslim territory, recovering Antioch, Aleppo, and much of northern Syria. These conquests weren't merely territorial acquisitions, but strategic triumphs that gave the empire control over the crucial trade routes, connecting Asia with Europe. The wealth that flowed from these recovered territories funded further expansion and cultural achievement. Picture the scenes of triumph as Byzantine armies marched through the streets of Antioch for the first time in over 3 centuries. The great city that had been one of Christianity's most important centers was once again under Christian rule. Its churches were restored to Orthodox worship, and its strategic position commanding the approaches to Syria was back in imperial hands. Similar celebrations erupted throughout the empire as news arrived of victory after victory against enemies who had seemed invincible just generations before. The Western campaigns were equally successful and strategically important. Byzantine forces in southern Italy gradually expelled the Arabs from Sicily and southern Italy, while the empire's naval forces dominated the eastern Mediterranean and challenged Muslim control of the sea itself. These victories not only recovered important territories, but also established the empire as a major player in Western European politics for the first time since Justinian's conquests. But perhaps the most significant military achievement of the Macedonian period was the final conquest of Bulgaria, completed by Basil II after decades of brutal warfare. The Bulgarian Empire under Samuil had emerged as the empire's most dangerous rival in the Balkans, controlling territories that stretched from the Adriatic to the Black Sea and threatening Constantinople itself. The war between Byzantium and Bulgaria was fought with unprecedented ferocity on both sides, culminating in Basil's victory at the Battle of Cleidion in 1014 CE. The aftermath of this victory revealed both the extent of Basil's triumph and the ruthless methods he employed to ensure its permanence. According to contemporary accounts, the emperor ordered the blinding of 15,000 Bulgarian prisoners, leaving 1 man in every 100 with 1 eye to guide the others home. When Samuil saw his defeated army returning in this condition, he reportedly died of shock, and Bulgarian resistance collapsed shortly thereafter. The conquest of Bulgaria completed the empire's domination of the Balkans and added enormously to its wealth and population. The Bulgarian territories were gradually integrated into the theme system, creating new sources of military recruitment and agricultural production. More importantly, the elimination of the Bulgarian threat allowed the empire to concentrate its resources on other frontiers, particularly the eastern campaigns against the Muslim Emirates. The economic prosperity that accompanied these military triumphs was reflected in every aspect of Byzantine society. Constantinople grew to become one of the world's largest cities, with a population approaching 1 million inhabitants. The city's markets overflowed with goods from across the known world: silk from China, spices from India, furs from Russia, and gold from Africa. The imperial workshops produced luxury goods that were coveted throughout Europe and the Islamic world, while Byzantine merchants established trading posts from Venice to the Crimea. The cultural achievements of the Macedonian Renaissance were equally impressive and more lasting than its military conquests. This period saw an extraordinary flowering of art, literature, and scholarship that drew inspiration from both classical antiquity and contemporary Christian themes. The illuminated manuscripts produced in Constantinople during this era, with their stunning miniatures and elaborate decorations, represent the pinnacle of medieval artistic achievement. You can imagine walking through the restored Hagia Sophia during this period, its interior gleaming with new mosaics that combine traditional iconographic themes with contemporary artistic innovations. The great mosaic of the Virgin and Child in the apse, dedicated in 867 CE, marked the official end of iconoclasm and the beginning of a new age of religious art. Throughout the empire, churches were decorated with magnificent frescoes and mosaics that proclaimed both imperial power and divine favor. The intellectual renaissance was equally remarkable. Byzantine scholars rediscovered and preserved classical texts that might otherwise have been lost forever, while also creating new works that synthesized ancient learning with Christian theology. The University of Constantinople, refounded during this period, became the premier center of higher learning in the medieval world, attracting students from across Europe and the Middle East. Perhaps most importantly, Byzantine missionaries during this period succeeded in converting the Slavic peoples of Eastern Europe to Orthodox Christianity, creating a cultural and religious sphere of influence that extended far beyond the empire's political boundaries. The missions of Saint Cyril and Methodius to the Slavs included the creation of the Cyrillic alphabet and the translation of religious texts into Slavonic languages. These achievements had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate religious goals, creating the foundation for the Orthodox Christian civilization that would dominate Eastern Europe for centuries. The conversion of Russia under Vladimir I in 988 CE represented the culmination of this missionary activity and created the most important long-term legacy of the Macedonian period. The marriage alliance between Vladimir and Anna Porphyrogenita Basil, the second sister, symbolized the empire's confidence and prestige, while the mass baptism of the Russian people in the Dnieper River extended Byzantine influence into regions that would never be under direct imperial control. The diplomatic achievements of the Macedonian emperors were as impressive as their military victories. Byzantine embassies reached the courts of Western European rulers, the Fatimid caliphs of Egypt, and even the distant empires of China and India. These diplomatic contacts not only enhanced the empire's prestige, but also facilitated the exchange of goods, ideas, and artistic influences that enriched Byzantine civilization. The legal and administrative reforms of the period created the governmental structure that would serve the empire for centuries. The basilica, completed under Leo VI the Wise, updated and systematized imperial law while maintaining its fundamental Roman character. The administrative reforms streamlined the bureaucracy and created more effective mechanisms for governing the empire's expanded territories. However, the very success of the Macedonian Renaissance contained the seeds of future problems. The territorial expansion required enormous military resources to maintain, while the wealth and sophistication of the empire created new forms of corruption and luxury that weakened military effectiveness. The theme system that had been so successful in creating a citizen-soldier army gradually evolved into a more traditional feudal structure that reduced the empire's military flexibility. When Basil II died in 1025 CE without a male heir, the Macedonian dynasty entered a period of decline that would culminate in the catastrophic defeat at Manzikert in 1071 CE. But the achievements of the Macedonian Renaissance had established the Byzantine Empire as one of history's great civilizations, and the cultural and religious influence it created would outlast the empire itself by many centuries. The Golden Age was ending, but its legacy would endure forever. Chapter 7. The Coming of the Turks. The morning of August 26, 1071. Sea dawned clear and hot on the Armenian plateau near the fortress town of Manzikert. As the sun rose over the mountains, two armies faced each other across the dusty plain in a confrontation that would change the course of world history. On one side stood the mighty military machine of the Byzantine Empire under Emperor Romanus IV Diogenes, heir to 6 centuries of Roman military tradition and master of territories stretching from the Danube to the Euphrates. On the other side waited the Seljuk Turks under Sultan Alp Arslan, nomadic warriors from the Central Asian steppes who had swept into the Middle East like a whirlwind of steel and fire. You can imagine the confidence that filled the Byzantine ranks as they prepared for battle. This was the same army that had conquered Bulgaria, reclaimed Antioch, and driven back the Arabs from the very gates of Constantinople. The emperor himself rode at the head of his troops, wearing the sacred regalia that linked him to Constantine and Justinian. Behind him marched the themes of Asia Minor, the iron spine of the empire's military might, alongside mercenary regiments from across the known world, Norman knights from Italy, Russian Varangians, German heavy cavalry, and Armenian auxiliaries. But the empire that Romanos IV led into battle was not the same invincible force that had dominated the medieval world under the Macedonian dynasty. The death of Basil II in 1025 CE had marked the beginning of a slow but inexorable decline that weakened every aspect of imperial power. A series of weak emperors had allowed the military themes to decay, while the central bureaucracy grew corrupt and inefficient. Worse still, the empire faced new enemies who possessed military technologies and tactical systems that neutralized traditional Byzantine advantages. The Seljuk Turks represented a fundamentally different type of threat than any the empire had faced before. Unlike the Arabs, who had sought to conquer and hold territory, the Turks were nomadic peoples whose entire society was organized around warfare and mobility. Their horse archers could strike with devastating effectiveness and then disappear. The four imperial forces could respond. Their decentralized command structure made them nearly impossible to defeat decisively, since the destruction of one army simply led to the emergence of another from the vast reservoirs of Central Asian manpower. Alp-Arslan himself was a leader worthy of respect from any age. Despite his youth, he was barely 30 years old. The Sultan had already proven himself one of the greatest military commanders of the medieval period. His conquest of Armenia and his raids into Byzantine territory had demonstrated both his strategic vision and his tactical brilliance. But perhaps most importantly, he understood that this battle was about more than immediate territorial gains. It was about the fundamental balance of power between the Islamic and Christian worlds. The battle that followed was a disaster of such magnitude that it marked a clear turning point in medieval history. Despite their initial advantages in numbers and equipment, the Byzantine forces were outmaneuvered and gradually worn down by the superior mobility and archery of the Turkish army. When rumors spread that the emperor had been killed, the imperial army began to disintegrate. Romanos IV was indeed captured, becoming the first Roman emperor to be taken prisoner in battle since Valerian's defeat by the Persians 8 centuries earlier. Picture the shock that reverberated through Constantinople when news of the disaster reached the capital. The unthinkable had happened. The emperor was a prisoner. The army was destroyed, and Asia Minor lay defenseless before the Turkish advance. In a single day, the careful work of centuries had been undone, and the empire faced the gravest crisis since the Arab conquests of the 7th century. The immediate aftermath of Manzikert revealed the extent to which internal weakness had undermined the empire's resilience. Rather than uniting against the external threat, the Byzantine nobility erupted into civil war. The Doukas family, longtime rivals of Romanos IV, refused to pay his ransom and instead seized power in Constantinople. When the emperor finally returned from captivity in 1072 CE, he found his own capital closed against him and was forced to fight a civil war against his own subjects, while Turkish raiders devastated his empire's heartland. The political chaos that followed Manzikert was perhaps even more devastating than the military defeat itself. For 3 crucial years, while Turkish tribes poured into Asia Minor and established permanent settlements, the empire was paralyzed by internal conflict. By the time stability was restored under Alexios I Komnenos in 1081 CE, most of Anatolia had been lost forever, and the empire's military and economic foundation had been permanently weakened. The loss of Asia Minor was catastrophic for the empire's long-term survival. These territories had provided the bulk of the empire's tax revenue, agricultural production, and military recruitment for over 4 centuries. The theme system that had been the foundation of Byzantine military power was effectively destroyed, forcing the empire to rely increasingly on expensive mercenaries who had no long-term loyalty to imperial interests. The human cost of the Turkish conquest was equally devastating. Entire cities were abandoned as their populations fled westward, seeking refuge in Constantinople or the remaining imperial territories. The sophisticated urban civilization that had flourished in Asia Minor since ancient times was replaced by a pastoral economy based on nomadic herding. Ancient centers of learning, like Caesarea and Trebizond, were reduced to frontier outposts, while countless monasteries and churches were destroyed or converted to mosques. You can imagine the desperation of the refugees who crowded into Constantinople during these dark years, bringing with them tales of destruction and displacement that seemed to herald the end of the world. The city that had been the pride of the medieval world now struggled to feed and house the flood of displaced persons, while its reduced tax base made it increasingly difficult to maintain the armies necessary for reconquest. But perhaps the most significant consequence of Manzikert was the way it transformed the empire's relationship with Western Europe. Faced with the loss of their Anatolian heartland and the Turkish threat to Constantinople itself, the Byzantine emperors were forced to seek help from the very Western powers they had traditionally regarded as barbarian upstarts. This decision would lead directly to the Crusades and ultimately to an even greater catastrophe than Manzikert itself. Alexios I Komnenos, who stabilized the empire after the chaos of the 1070s, was a skilled diplomat as well as a capable military commander. His appeal to Pope Urban II for military assistance against the Turks was carefully calculated to exploit Western concerns about Muslim expansion while offering the prospect of reuniting Eastern and Western Christianity under papal authority. But Alexios could never have anticipated the full consequences of his diplomatic initiative. The First Crusade that resulted from Urban II's preaching in 1095 CE achieved far more than anyone had expected. The Crusader armies not only defeated the Seljuk Turks, but also conquered Jerusalem and established a series of Latin states throughout Syria and Palestine. For a brief moment, it seemed that the empire might recover its lost territories and restore the Mediterranean world to Christian rule. However, the relationship between Byzantium and the Crusader states was troubled from the beginning. The Western Knights had little understanding of or respect for Byzantine traditions and customs, while the emperors were concerned about the implications of independent Latin states on their traditional sphere of influence. These tensions would grow worse with each subsequent crusade, ultimately leading to open conflict between allies who should have been united against their common Muslim enemies. The military innovations that emerged from the empire's encounter with Turkish warfare had important long-term consequences for medieval military development. The devastating effectiveness of Turkish horse archers forced Byzantine commanders to develop new tactical systems that emphasize mobility and missile warfare over the traditional emphasis on heavy infantry and defensive formations. These innovations influenced military thinking throughout the Mediterranean world and contributed to the evolution of medieval warfare. The economic consequences of the Turkish conquest extended far beyond the immediate loss of territory. The disruption of traditional trade routes forced the empire to develop new commercial relationships and rely more heavily on Italian merchants for long-distance trade. This increased dependence on foreign commercial expertise gradually undermined the empire's economic independence and contributed to the growing influence of Venice and Genoa in Byzantine affairs. When Alexios I died in 1118 CE, he left behind an empire that had survived the immediate crisis of Manzikert, but had been fundamentally transformed by the experience. The truncated state that his son John II inherited was more compact and defensible than the vast empire of the Macedonian period, but it was also more vulnerable and dependent on external alliances for its survival. The age of Byzantine dominance was ending, but the empire's genius for adaptation and survival would enable it to endure for another 3.5 centuries. The lessons learned from Manzikert and its aftermath would shape imperial strategy for generations to come, as successive emperors struggled to rebuild their strength while navigating the increasingly complex political landscape of the medieval world. Chapter 8. The Crusades. As the 12th century dawned, the Byzantine Empire found itself in the paradoxical position of having survived its greatest military disaster only to face a new and unexpected challenge from its supposed allies. The Crusades, which Emperor Alexios I had helped to inspire through his appeals for Western military assistance, were transforming the political landscape of the Eastern Mediterranean in ways that no one could have predicted. What had begun as a desperate request for mercenaries to fight the Seljuk Turks had evolved into a movement that would ultimately pose a greater threat to Byzantium than any Muslim army. You can imagine the mixture of hope and apprehension that filled the corridors of the Great Palace as reports arrived of the Crusader victories in Syria and Palestine. On one hand, the establishment of the Crusader states had created a Christian buffer between the empire and the Muslim powers of the Middle East. Jerusalem was once again under Christian rule. Antioch had been liberated from Turkish control, and the threat to Constantinople from Seljuk expansion had been significantly reduced. But experienced Byzantine diplomats also recognized the dangers inherent in the new situation. The Crusader states were independent political entities that owed no allegiance to the Byzantine emperor, despite being established on territories that the empire regarded as its rightful patrimony. The Western knights who ruled these states had little understanding of or respect for the complex web of alliances and rivalries that had traditionally governed politics in the region. More ominously, the success of the First Crusade had demonstrated Western military superiority in a way that undermined Byzantine prestige throughout the region. For centuries, the empire had been regarded as the premier Christian power, the heir to Roman imperial authority, and the natural leader of Christian resistance to Muslim expansion. Now, suddenly, Western armies had achieved victories that had eluded Byzantine forces for decades, calling into question the empire's continued relevance in the new medieval world order. The reign of John II Komnenos, 1118 to 1143 CE, represented the empire's most sustained attempt to adapt to these new realities while maintaining its traditional objectives. Known to his contemporaries as John the Beautiful for both his physical appearance and his moral character, this remarkable emperor spent his entire reign attempting to restore imperial control over the territories lost to the Turks, while managing the complex diplomatic relationships with the Crusader states. John's military campaigns in Asia Minor achieved considerable success in pushing back Turkish settlement and restoring imperial control over strategic areas along the Black Sea coast and the Western Highlands. His systematic approach to reconquest, based on the establishment of fortified positions and the gradual expansion of imperial authority, demonstrated that the empire retained significant military capabilities despite the disaster at Manzikert. Picture the emperor leading his armies through the recovered territories of northern Anatolia, visiting cities that had been under Turkish rule for over half a century and receiving the grateful submissions of Christian populations who had maintained their faith despite decades of Muslim domination. These campaigns not only recovered important territories, but also demonstrated to both allies and enemies that the Byzantine Empire remained a formidable military power. The emperor's intervention in the affairs of the Crusader states revealed both the possibilities and the limitations of Byzantine policy in the post-Crusade era. John's siege of Antioch in 1137–1138 CE successfully compelled Prince Raymond to acknowledge imperial suzerainty and agreed to participate in joint campaigns against Muslim forces. However, the practical implementation of these agreements proved difficult, as the Western nobles consistently pursued their own interests rather than imperial objectives. The joint Byzantine Crusader siege of Khazar in 1138 CE illustrated the fundamental problems that plagued cooperation between East and West. Despite achieving initial success, the campaign collapsed when disputes arose over the division of potential conquests. The Crusader princes, accustomed to the independent action that had brought them success in the First Crusade, chafed at accepting direction from the Byzantine emperor, while John was unwilling to allow Western adventurers to establish new states on territory he regarded as belonging to the empire. Manuel I Comnenus, who succeeded his father in 1143 CE, took a radically different approach to the challenges facing the empire. Fascinated by Western culture and convinced that the future lay in closer cooperation with the Latin West, Manuel pursued policies that gradually integrated Byzantine diplomacy into the emerging European state system while maintaining the empire's traditional claims to supremacy in the Eastern Mediterranean. The emperor's marriage to Bertha of Sulzbach, a relative of the Holy Roman Emperor Conrad III, symbolized this new orientation toward the West. Manuel's court became a cosmopolitan center where Western knights served alongside Byzantine nobles, where Latin and Greek scholars collaborated on scholarly projects, and where the traditions of East and West were synthesized into new forms of cultural expression. But Manuel's most ambitious project was his attempt to restore imperial control over Italy and challenge the growing power of the Norman Kingdom of Sicily. The emperor's Italian campaigns, conducted in alliance with the Pope and the German Emperor, represented the last serious Byzantine attempt to restore the Mediterranean empire that Justinian had created 6 centuries earlier. You can envision the excitement in Constantinople as news arrived of early Byzantine successes in southern Italy. Imperial forces had landed in Brindisi. Italian cities were opening their gates to the emperor's representatives, and it seemed that the dream of reuniting East and West under imperial authority might finally be achieved. Manuel himself traveled to Italy to supervise the campaigns, becoming the first emperor to set foot on Italian soil since the Arab conquest of Sicily. However, the Italian adventure ultimately demonstrated the limits of Byzantine power in the new medieval world. Despite initial successes, the empire lacked the resources to sustain major campaigns in the West while maintaining its defenses in Asia Minor and the Balkans. The decisive defeat of the imperial army at Brindisi in 1156 CE marked the end of Byzantine ambitions in Italy and forced Manuel to concentrate on more immediate threats. The growing power of Venice and the other Italian maritime republics created additional challenges for imperial policy. These commercial powers had largely replaced Byzantine merchants in the lucrative trade between Europe and Asia, reducing the empire's income while increasing its dependence on foreign commercial expertise. The trading privileges granted to Venice in 1082 CE in exchange for naval support against the Normans had created a precedent that other Italian cities exploited to establish their own commercial colonies within the empire. The massacre of Latin merchants in Constantinople in 1182 CE revealed the depth of popular resentment against Western commercial dominance and foreign influence in imperial affairs. The riots, which targeted not only Italian merchants but also Western clergy and scholars, reflected widespread anxiety about the empire's changing relationship with the Latin West and fears that traditional Byzantine identity was being undermined by foreign influences. These tensions came to a catastrophic climax during the Fourth Crusade, which began in 1202 CE as yet another attempt to recover the Holy Land from Muslim control. The diversion of the Crusader army to Constantinople was the result of a complex web of commercial and political interests that involved Venetian merchants, exiled Byzantine nobles, and ambitious Western leaders who saw an opportunity to solve their financial problems at the expense of the Eastern Empire. The Siege of Constantinople in 1203 to 1204 CE was unlike any crisis the empire had faced in its 9th-century history. For the first time since its founding, the imperial capital faced assault by a Christian army that possessed both the military, technology, and the strategic knowledge necessary to breach its legendary defenses. The corruption and incompetence of the Angelos dynasty had left the empire unprepared for such a challenge, while the alienation of the population from their rulers undermined the unity that had previously enabled the city to withstand far greater threats. Picture the horror and disbelief that gripped the population of Constantinople as the Crusader army breached the seawall and poured into the city on April 13, 1204 CE. For over 8 centuries, the new Rome had stood inviolate, protected by its walls, its fleet, and the favor of God. Now, suddenly, Latin soldiers were running through the streets, looting churches, destroying priceless works of art, and reducing the greatest city of the medieval world to a smoking ruin. The sack of Constantinople represented one of history's greatest cultural catastrophes. Countless manuscripts, artworks, and religious relics that had survived the rise and fall of empires were destroyed or scattered. The imperial library, which had preserved much of the literature of classical antiquity, was largely destroyed. The unity of Eastern Christianity, which had been maintained for over a millennium, was shattered as Western clerics attempted to impose Latin rites on Greek churches. The establishment of the Latin Empire of Constantinople and the partition of Byzantine territories among Western nobles marked the end of the medieval Byzantine Empire as a great power. Although successor states in Nicaea, Epirus, and Trebizond maintained claims to imperial legitimacy, the civilization that had dominated the Eastern Mediterranean for centuries had been effectively destroyed by the very allies who had promised to defend it. The Fourth Crusade's impact extended far beyond the immediate political consequences. It permanently poisoned relations between Eastern and Western Christianity, creating a legacy of mistrust that persists to this day. It also marked the definitive end of Byzantine dominance in Mediterranean trade and politics, clearing the way for the rise of Italian city-states and ultimately for the expansion of Islamic power into Europe. When the last Latin emperor fled Constantinople in 1261 CE, he left behind a city and an empire that would never fully recover from the trauma of Western betrayal. The lesson was clear. The greatest threats to Christian civilization sometimes came not from without, but from within. Chapter 9. The Nicene Restoration on July 25, 1261 CE. A small force of Byzantine soldiers slipped through a forgotten gate in Constantinople's land wall and recaptured the imperial capital after 57 years of Latin occupation. Leading this remarkable achievement was Michael VIII Palaiologos, Emperor of Nicaea, whose careful planning and diplomatic skill had made possible what many thought impossible: the restoration of the Byzantine Empire. But as the purple banner of Byzantium once again flew over the Hagia Sophia, the empire that was being restored bore little resemblance to the mighty state that had ruled the Eastern Mediterranean for over 8 centuries. You can imagine the emotions that swept through the city as news spread that the Latins had fled and Greek emperors once again ruled from the Great Palace. For over half a century, the citizens of Constantinople had endured foreign rule, watching as their ancient traditions were suppressed and their sacred spaces were defiled by Western customs. Churches that had echoed with Greek liturgy for centuries had been converted to Latin rites, while Frankish nobles had occupied the palaces where Roman emperors had held court since the time of Constantine. The restoration was made possible by the remarkable achievements of the Empire of Nicaea, the most successful of the Byzantine successor states that had emerged from the wreckage of 1204. Under the leadership of the Lascaris dynasty, particularly John III Vatatzes, this truncated empire had not only survived the catastrophe of the Fourth Crusade, but had gradually rebuilt the military and economic strength necessary to challenge Latin rule in Constantinople. The success of Nicaea demonstrated the continuing vitality of Byzantine civilization even in its darkest hour. Cut off from their traditional capital and reduced to controlling only a portion of Asia Minor, the Nicene emperors had created a more compact but also more efficient state that drew strength from necessity and unity of purpose. The theme system was reformed and revitalized. The bureaucracy was streamlined, and new sources of revenue were developed to fund the military campaigns that would eventually restore the empire. But Michael VIII's triumph in 1261 was only the beginning of an even greater challenge: how to rebuild an empire from the fragments of a shattered civilization. The Constantinople that the Palaiologos dynasty inherited was a shadow of its former self. The population had declined to perhaps 100,000 inhabitants, down from the million or more who had lived there during the Macedonian Renaissance. Entire districts lay in ruins. The great harbor of the Golden Horn had silted up from neglect, and many of the city's most magnificent buildings had been damaged or destroyed during the Latin occupation. The economic challenges facing the restored empire were even more daunting than the physical destruction. The Latin conquest had shattered the commercial networks that had made Byzantium wealthy, while Italian merchants had taken over much of the trade that had previously enriched the imperial treasury. Venice, Genoa, and Pisa had established virtual commercial monopolies in many parts of the Eastern Mediterranean, leaving the Byzantine government dependent on customs duties and tribute payments for much of its revenue. Michael VIII's reign, 1261 to 1282 CE, was defined by his desperate attempts to secure the restored empire against the multiple threats that surrounded it. In the West, Charles of Anjou was building a powerful kingdom in southern Italy and Sicily, while harboring ambitions to reconquer Constantinople for the Latin Empire. In the north, the emerging powers of Bulgaria and Serbia were expanding at Byzantine expense. In the east, Turkish Emirates were gradually absorbing the remaining imperial territories in Asia Minor. The Emperor Sau's solution to these overwhelming challenges was characteristically Byzantine, a complex web of diplomatic alliances designed to prevent his enemies from uniting against him while playing them off against each other. The most controversial of these diplomatic initiatives was his negotiation of church union with Rome, announced at the Council of Lyon in 1274 CE, which promised to reunite Eastern and Western Christianity under papal authority in exchange for Western protection against Angevin attack. Picture the outrage that erupted throughout the empire when news of the Union agreement reached the provinces. For over a millennium, the Orthodox Church had maintained its independence from Roman control, and the memory of Latin persecution during the Crusader period was still fresh in popular memory. Riots erupted in Constantinople. Monks fled to remote monasteries rather than accept papal authority, and entire provinces threatened rebellion against an emperor they now viewed as a traitor to the faith. The church union controversy revealed the fundamental tension between political necessity and cultural identity that would plague the Palaiologian dynasty throughout its existence. While the emperors understood that the empire's survival required accommodation with Western powers, the Byzantine population remained deeply committed to the Orthodox traditions that had defined their civilization for centuries. This internal division weakened the empire's ability to respond effectively to external threats while creating opportunities for enemies to exploit religious differences for political advantage. The reign of Andronicus II Palaiologos, 1282 to 1328 CE, illustrated both the possibilities and the limitations of the restored empire. A scholar and patron of the arts rather than a warrior, Andronicus presided over a remarkable cultural renaissance that saw the creation of magnificent works of art, literature, and scholarship that rivaled the achievements of any previous era. The mosaics and frescoes created during this period, such as those in the Chora Church, Kurikami, represent the pinnacle of Byzantine artistic achievement and demonstrate the continuing vitality of the empire's cultural traditions. But Andronikos, as specific inclinations and financial constraints, left the empire increasingly vulnerable to military pressure from its neighbors. The emperor's decision to disband much of the imperial navy in order to reduce expenses proved particularly disastrous, as it allowed Turkish emirates to establish control over much of the Aegean Sea and launch raids against the empire's remaining territories with impunity. The rise of the Ottoman Beylik in northwestern Anatolia during this period marked the beginning of the final phase in Byzantine history. Under the leadership of Osman I and his successors, this small Turkish principality gradually absorbed its rivals while expanding into European territory across the Dardanelles. The Ottomans proved to be different from the other Turkish emirates that had plagued the empire for centuries. They possessed not only military effectiveness, but also administrative sophistication and a clear vision of imperial expansion that would ultimately encompass much of the medieval world. You can imagine the growing anxiety in Constantinople as reports arrived of Ottoman victories and territorial expansion. Unlike previous Turkish raiders who had been content with plunder and tribute, the Ottomans were clearly building a permanent state that aimed to replace rather than merely exploit Byzantine power. Their conquest of Bursa in 1326 CE gave them a permanent capital within sight of Constantinople, while their capture of Gallipoli in 1354 CE established their first permanent foothold in Europe. The civil wars that racked the empire during the 14th century accelerated its decline and provided opportunities for the Ottomans to expand their influence in Byzantine affairs. The conflict between John V Palaiologos and John VI Kantakouzenos drew in foreign powers on both sides, with the Ottomans supporting Kantakouzenos in exchange for territorial concessions and tribute payments. These internal conflicts not only weakened the empire militarily, but also legitimized Ottoman intervention in imperial politics. The devastating impact of the Black Death, which reached Constantinople in 1347 CE, further reduced the empire's ability to resist external pressure. The plague killed perhaps one-third of the empire's remaining population, disrupting agriculture and commerce while reducing the military manpower available for defense. Many rural areas were completely depopulated, forcing the abandonment of fortified positions that had protected the empire's borders for centuries. Despite these overwhelming challenges, the Paleologian period also witnessed remarkable achievements in scholarship, theology, and the arts that enriched not only Byzantine civilization, but the broader European cultural development. The humanist movement that emerged in the empire during this period, led by scholars like Gemistos Plethon and Cardinal Bessarion, helped to transmit Greek classical learning to Western Europe and contributed to the Renaissance that was beginning to transform European intellectual life. The theological synthesis achieved by Gregory Palamas and the Hesychist movement provided a sophisticated, philosophical framework that influenced Orthodox theology for centuries to come. The Emperor John VIII's participation in the Council of Florence in 1439 CE, despite its ultimate failure to achieve lasting church union, demonstrated the empire's continued importance in European diplomatic and religious affairs even as its political power declined. When Constantine XI Palaiologos ascended the throne in 1449 CE, he inherited an empire that controlled little more than Constantinople itself and a few scattered territories in the Peloponnese and the Aegean Islands. The great civilization that had preserved Roman law, Greek learning, and Christian faith for over a millennium was reduced to a shadow of its former self, surrounded by enemies and sustained more by the memory of past greatness than by present power. But even in its final extremity, the Byzantine Empire retained the cultural coherence and institutional continuity that had enabled it to survive previous catastrophes. The question facing the last emperor was whether these intangible assets would prove sufficient to sustain the empire through what was clearly its greatest crisis since the Arab invasions of the 7th century. The answer would come soon enough, as the canons of Mehmed the Conqueror began to test the legendary walls that had protected the last remnant of Rome for over 1,000 years. Chapter 10. The final siege in the early hours of May 29, 1453. As the Ottoman cannons fell silent after their thunderous bombardment, an eerie calm settled over the battlefield before the walls of Constantinople. Emperor Constantine XI Palaeologos stood with his remaining defenders on the ramparts that had protected the city for over 1,000 years, knowing that this dawn would bring either miraculous deliverance or the end of the Roman Empire that had endured for over 2 millennia. You can imagine the emperor's thoughts as he gazed out over the massive Ottoman army that surrounded his capital. At 48 years old, Constantine had ruled for only 4 years, but those years had been consumed by the desperate task of preparing for the siege that everyone knew was inevitable. Sultan Mehmed II, barely 21 years old, but already acclaimed as one of history's great military minds, had made no secret of his intention to add Constantinople to his growing empire. The young sultan had reportedly declared that he would rather die than fail to capture the city that had defied Muslim conquest for over 8 centuries. The preparation for this final siege had taken Mehmed 3 years of meticulous planning and unprecedented military innovation. The Sultan had assembled the largest army ever brought against Constantinople, perhaps 150,000 men drawn from across the Ottoman Empire and beyond. More ominously, he had commissioned the Hungarian engineer Orban to construct the largest cannons ever built. Massive bronze monsters capable of hurling stone balls weighing over half a ton against the city's ancient walls. Constantine's preparations were necessarily more modest, but no less determined. The emperor had perhaps 7,000 men to defend walls that stretched for nearly 4 miles, including about 2,000 foreign volunteers who had come to fight for the last Christian emperor in the East. The most notable of these volunteers was Giovanni Giustiniani, a Genoese nobleman whose expertise in siege warfare gave the defenders their only hope of withstanding the Ottoman assault. The siege began on April 6, 1453, with the systematic placement of Ottoman forces around the entire perimeter of the city. Mehmed had learned from the failures of previous sieges that Constantinople could only be taken if all possible escape routes were sealed and no relief could reach the defenders. His fleet in the Bosphorus was supplemented by the ingenious transportation of ships overland into the Golden Horn, bypassing the great chain that had protected the harbor for centuries. Picture the awe and terror that gripped the city's population as Orban's great cannon fired its first shot. The massive stone ball smashed into the outer wall near the gate of St. Romanos, creating a breach that would have been unthinkable with traditional siege equipment. For the first time in over a millennium, the walls that had protected Constantinople appeared vulnerable to human assault. The psychological impact of the cannon was perhaps even greater than its physical damage. For over 8 centuries, the citizens of Constantinople had taken comfort in the knowledge that their walls had never been breached by enemy assault. The Great Land Wall, built by Theodosius II in the 5th century and strengthened by countless emperors since, had withstood sieges by Avars, Arabs, Bulgars, and Russians. The very stones seemed blessed by divine protection, and many believed that the city could not fall while the true cross and other sacred relics remained within its walls. But Constantine understood that divine favor alone would not save his empire. The emperor threw himself into the defense with a determination that inspired his outnumbered troops and earned the grudging respect of his enemies. He personally supervised the repair of breaches in the wall, allied sorties against Ottoman positions, and maintained the morale of his forces through his own example of courage and dedication. The emperor's appeals for help from Western Europe reveal both the empire's desperation and the changed political realities of the 15th century. While some Italian cities provided token assistance and individual volunteers answered the call to defend Christendom's eastern bastion, the major European powers were too consumed with their own conflicts to provide meaningful aid. The promises of church union made at the Council of Florence in 1439 had proven empty, and Constantinople faced its final trial essentially alone. The siege settled into a pattern of Ottoman bombardment, followed by repair work by the defenders, punctuated by increasingly desperate attempts to break the deadlock. Mem's engineers dug tunnels under the walls, but these were detected and destroyed by Serbian mining expert Orban, who had defected from Ottoman service after a dispute over payment. The Sultan's attempts to storm the walls were repulsed with heavy losses, while a small fleet of Christian ships managed to break through the Ottoman blockade and reach the city with supplies and reinforcements. You can envision the hope that briefly flickered through the city when news arrived that Hungarian King Ladislaus III was marching to relieve the siege. But the crusade that had seemed to offer salvation ended in disaster at the Battle of Varna, where the young king was killed, and the last serious attempt to save Constantinople was destroyed. The emperor and his people were truly alone now, facing an enemy whose resources seemed limitless and whose determination matched their own. The final assault began before dawn on May 29, 1453. As Ottoman forces launched simultaneous attacks on multiple sections of the wall. The first waves consisted of irregular troops and volunteers whose purpose was to exhaust the defenders and probe for weaknesses. These were followed by the elite Janissary corps, the Sultan's household troops whose discipline and training made them the finest infantry in the world. The crucial moment came when Giustiniani, the Genoese commander whose skill and courage had been essential to the defense, was wounded by Ottoman fire and carried away from the walls. His departure created a gap in the defenses, just as the Janissaries launched their final assault on a section of wall near the gate of St. Romanos that had been weakened by weeks of bombardment. Constantine himself rushed to fill the breach, casting aside the imperial regalia that might have identified him to the enemy and fighting as a simple soldier alongside his men. Contemporary accounts describe the emperor's final moments as worthy of the greatest heroes of antiquity standing in the breach with sword in hand as the Ottoman tide swept over the walls and into the city that had been the heart of his empire. The emperor's body was never definitively identified among the thousands of dead that littered the battleground, but his purple boots were reportedly found by Ottoman soldiers who had heard of his last stand. Mem II, when informed of the emperor's death, is said to have expressed genuine sorrow for the fate of a worthy enemy, ordering that Constantine be buried with imperial honors and forbidding the desecration of his remains. The fall of Constantinople sent shockwaves throughout the Christian world and marked the end of an era that had lasted for over 1,000 years. The city that had been the new Rome, the center of Eastern Christianity, and the guardian of classical learning was now the capital of an Islamic empire that would dominate the Eastern Mediterranean for centuries to come. The immediate aftermath of the conquest revealed both the magnitude of the cultural catastrophe and the pragmatic wisdom of the Ottoman approach to ruling diverse populations. While many of the city's treasures were looted and some of its churches were converted to mosques, Mem II also took steps to preserve much of the city's character and to maintain continuity with its Byzantine past. The Sultan proclaimed himself Caesar of Rome, claiming to be the legitimate heir to the Roman imperial tradition, and appointed a new Orthodox patriarch to maintain the religious life of the city's Greek population. The fate of the city's manuscripts and artistic treasures was mixed but not uniformly catastrophic. While many priceless works were destroyed or scattered, others were preserved in the Sultan's libraries or carried away by scholars who fled to Western Europe. These refugees, including men like Cardinal Bessarion and George of Trebizond, brought with them the learning of centuries and contributed significantly to the Renaissance that was transforming European intellectual life. The human cost of the conquest was severe, but not as complete as many had feared. While thousands died in the fighting and immediate aftermath, Mem's policies ensured that much of the city's population survived and that Byzantine culture continued under Ottoman rule. The Fanner district became the center of Greek Orthodox life in the Ottoman Empire, and the ecumenical patriarchate continued to serve the spiritual needs of Orthodox Christians throughout the Sultan's domains. When the last emperor fell defending the walls of Constantinople, he took with him not just his own life, but the final remnant of the Roman Empire that had been founded by Augustus and renewed by Constantine. But the civilization he died defending, with its synthesis of Greek learning, Roman law, and Christian faith, would survive in new forms and continue to influence the development of European culture for centuries to come. The Byzantine Empire was dead, but Byzantium lived on in the hearts and minds of those who cherished the values it had preserved and transmitted across the centuries. Chapter 11. The final hour as the sun rose over the Bosphorus on the morning of May 29, 1453. The greatest city of the medieval world lay in the hands of Sultan Mehmed II, a 21-year-old conqueror who had achieved what countless Muslim rulers had dreamed of for over 8 centuries. The purple banner of Byzantium, which had flown over Constantinople for more than a millennium, had been replaced by the green flag of Islam, and the last echo of the Roman Empire had finally been silenced. You can imagine the scene as Mehmed entered the Hagia Sophia for the first time as its new master. The great church that had stood as the cathedral of Eastern Christianity for nearly 1,000 years now witnessed the young sultan's prostration in Islamic prayer. When the imam's call to prayer echoed through the space that had once heard the Greek liturgy chanted by Byzantine priests, it marked not just the conquest of a city, but the transformation of an entire civilization. The Sultan's treatment of his conquered capital revealed both the pragmatic wisdom and the imperial ambitions that would characterize Ottoman rule for centuries to come. Rather than destroying the city or massacring its population, the traditional fate of cities that resisted siege, Mehmed chose to preserve and transform Constantinople into the jewel of his growing empire. His famous declaration that the city belongs to me, but the buildings belong to God, reflected a sophisticated understanding of how to transform military conquest into lasting political control. The 3-day period of sanctioned looting that followed the city's fall was brutal but limited, designed to reward the Sultan's troops while preventing the complete destruction of the city's wealth and infrastructure. Ottoman soldiers ransacked private homes and public buildings, carrying away whatever treasures they could find. But the systematic preservation of the city's most important structures ensured that Constantinople's transformation rather than its destruction would be Mehmed's legacy. The fate of the city's population during these chaotic days varied enormously depending on location, social status, and simple luck. Many nobles and wealthy merchants were captured and held for ransom, while skilled craftsmen and scholars were often retained by the Sultan to serve his new administration. The common people suffered the usual hardships of conquest, looting, violence, and displacement, but Mehmed's policies of encouraging resettlement and economic recovery meant that the city's decline was temporary rather than permanent. Picture the complex emotions that must have filled the hearts of the surviving Byzantine nobles as they witnessed the transformation of their ancient capital. The palaces where their ancestors had served Roman emperors were now occupied by Ottoman officials. The churches where they had worshipped were being converted to mosques, and the very language of government was changing from Greek to Turkish and Arabic. Yet many of these same nobles would find places in the new order, serving Mehmed's administration with the same skills they had once offered to Constantine XI. The ecumenical patriarchate's survival under Ottoman rule illustrated Mehmed's sophisticated approach to governing diverse religious communities. Rather than attempting to force mass conversion to Islam, the Sultan chose to work within existing religious structures while ensuring their loyalty to his regime. The appointment of Gennadios Scholarios as the new patriarch created a precedent for Ottoman religious policy that would govern Christian-Muslim relations in the empire for centuries. This system of religious autonomy, later formalized as the Millet system, allowed Byzantine religious and cultural traditions to survive under Islamic political control. The Greek Orthodox Church maintained its spiritual authority over the empire's Christian population, administered its own schools and courts, and preserved the theological and liturgical traditions that had defined Byzantine Christianity for over a millennium. The architectural transformation of Constantinople reflected the broader cultural changes that accompanied the Ottoman conquest. While some churches were converted to mosques through the addition of minarets and the removal of Christian imagery, others were preserved as museums or allowed to continue functioning as Christian places of worship. The Hagia Sophia itself underwent a complex transformation that attempted to preserve its architectural magnificence while adapting it to Islamic religious requirements. Mehmed's building program in the conquered city demonstrated his intention to make Constantinople the center of a new Islamic empire that would rival and surpass its Byzantine predecessor. The construction of the Topkapi Palace as the new imperial residence, the establishment of markets and caravanserais to encourage trade, and the creation of madrasas and mosques to serve the Muslim population all proclaimed the Sultan's vision of a restored and enlarged empire centered on the Bosphorus. The economic revival of Constantinople under Ottoman rule was remarkably swift and comprehensive. Within a generation of the conquest, the city's population had not only recovered but exceeded its pre-1453 levels as Muslim settlers, Jewish refugees from Spain, and Christian merchants from throughout the Mediterranean were attracted by the opportunities offered by the new imperial capital. The city's strategic position at the crossroads of Europe and Asia made it naturally prosperous, while Ottoman policies of religious tolerance and commercial freedom created conditions for sustained economic growth. The intellectual consequences of the conquest extended far beyond the immediate political changes. The flight of Byzantine scholars to Western Europe, carrying with them precious manuscripts and centuries of accumulated learning, contributed significantly to the European Renaissance. Men like Cardinal Bessarion, George of Trebizond, and Marcus Musurus brought Greek classical texts and Orthodox theological traditions to Italian universities and papal courts, enriching Western scholarship while preserving Eastern learning for future generations. The preservation and transmission of Byzantine legal traditions under Ottoman rule ensured that Roman law continued to influence legal development in the Eastern Mediterranean even after the empire's political demise. The Hexabiblos of Constantine Harmonopoulos, a Byzantine legal manual, continued to be used in Greek courts under Ottoman rule and influenced the development of modern Greek civil law. You can imagine the profound psychological impact of Constantinople's fall on Christians throughout Europe and the Orthodox world. For over 8 centuries, the great city had served as the bastion of Eastern Christianity, the guardian of Orthodox tradition, and the symbol of Christian resistance to Islamic expansion. Its fall seemed to many contemporaries to herald the end times, or at least to mark a decisive shift in the cosmic struggle between Christianity and Islam. The reactions of European rulers to news of the conquest revealed both genuine shock and cynical calculation. While some, like Pope Nicholas V, called for new crusades to recover the lost city, others saw opportunities to exploit Ottoman expansion for their own political advantage. The complex system of European alliances that had developed during the late medieval period meant that some Christian rulers were already aligned with the Ottomans against their European rivals. The survival of Orthodox Christianity in the Ottoman Empire, while different from its earlier imperial form, demonstrated the resilience of the religious and cultural traditions that Byzantium had preserved for over a millennium. The patriarchal churches of Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria continued to maintain communion with Constantinople under Ottoman rule, preserving the unity of Orthodox Christianity despite political fragmentation. The Ottoman Empire's expansion into Europe following the conquest of Constantinople fulfilled Mehmed's ambitions to create a universal Islamic empire while paradoxically preserving many aspects of Byzantine civilization. Ottoman administrative practices, court ceremonies, and even architectural styles showed significant Byzantine influence, suggesting that the conquest involved not just military victory, but cultural synthesis. The question of what constituted the true end of the Byzantine Empire has been debated by historians for centuries. While 1453 marks the fall of the last Byzantine state, the Empire of Trebizond survived until 1461, the Despotate of the Morea until 1460, and various other claimants to Byzantine legitimacy persisted even longer. More importantly, the cultural and religious traditions that it defined Byzantine civilization continued to evolve under Ottoman rule and eventually contributed to the development of modern Greek national identity. The legacy of the Byzantine Empire extended far beyond its political existence. The preservation of classical Greek literature, the development of Orthodox theology, the codification of Roman law, and the creation of architectural masterpieces like the Hagia Sophia all ensured that Byzantine contributions to world civilization would outlast the empire itself. The empire's example of cultural synthesis combining Greek intellectual traditions, Roman political structures, and Christian religious faith provided a model for other societies attempting to bridge different cultural traditions. When Mehmed II proclaimed himself Caesar of Rome after his conquest of Constantinople, he was not merely claiming a title, but asserting continuity with the imperial tradition that had shaped the Eastern Mediterranean for over a millennium. The Ottoman Empire that emerged from the conquest of Byzantium would go on to dominate much of Europe, Asia, and Africa for centuries, but it would do so while incorporating many of the administrative, cultural, and even architectural traditions of its Byzantine predecessor. The Byzantine Empire was dead, but the civilization it had created and preserved would continue to influence the development of both the Islamic and Christian worlds for centuries to come. In death, as in life, Byzantium proved that the greatest empires are remembered not just for their military conquests, but for the cultural treasures they preserve and transmit to future generations. As we reach the end of our journey through the 11 centuries of Byzantine history, we find ourselves contemplating a civilization that achieved something almost unique in human experience: the successful preservation and transmission of an ancient heritage through the transformative challenges of the medieval world. The Byzantine Empire that fell to men's cannons in 1453 was the last living link to the world of Caesar and Augustus, of Pericles and Plato, of the Apostles and the early Church Fathers. The Byzantines themselves never ceased to call themselves Romans, and in the truest sense, they were. They preserved Roman law through the Dark Ages when Western Europe had forgotten its meaning. They maintained the institutional continuity of the Roman state when the Western Empire had collapsed into feudal fragments. They upheld the imperial ideal of universal rule guided by divine favor when medieval kingdoms were content with local authority. Most remarkably, they succeeded in synthesizing this Roman political heritage with Greek intellectual culture and Christian religious faith into a civilization that was greater than the sum of its parts. The legacy of Byzantium touches every aspect of our modern world. When we speak of human rights and legal equality, we invoke principles first codified in Justinian's legal reforms. When we admire the great cathedrals of Europe or the artistic masterpieces of the Renaissance, we see the influence of Byzantine aesthetic traditions. When we encounter the literature of Russia or the architecture of the Balkans, we witness the cultural inheritance of Byzantine civilization. Perhaps most importantly, the Byzantine Empire demonstrated that civilizations can survive the most catastrophic challenges through adaptation, resilience, and commitment to their core values. The empire that Constantine founded in 330 CE faced invasions, plagues, civil wars, economic collapse, and religious controversies that would have destroyed any ordinary state. Yet it endured for over a millennium because its people never lost faith in their mission to preserve and protect the treasures of human civilization. Today, as we face our own challenges of cultural preservation and political change. The example of Byzantium reminds us that the greatest achievements of human civilization are not the conquests of individual leaders or the wealth of particular generations, but the intellectual, artistic, and spiritual treasures that each age preserves and transmits to the future. In this sense, Byzantium never truly died. It lives on wherever people value learning over ignorance, beauty over destruction, and faith over despair. The last emperor may have fallen defending the walls of Constantinople, but the civilization he died protecting continues to enrich and inspire humanity more than 5 centuries after his empire's political death. The Romans of the East have achieved their greatest victory, immortality, through cultural legacy.